Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's AFTD educational webinar, FTD and Genetic Testing, a Practical Approach. This is the first in a series of 3 genetics-focused webinars that AFTD will be presenting in the coming months. I'm Sharon Denny, AFTD's Senior Director of Programs, and on behalf of everyone here, thank you for joining us today. A few housekeeping items before I introduce our guest presenters. Please note that our audience will be muted for the duration of the presentation. This helps to keep the background noise to a minimum so that everyone can hear the presenters clearly. If you have any technical issues, please write a message in the questions box, and AFTD's Lauren Gauthier will try to address them with you. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the presentation, so please type your questions in this box as you think of them, and we'll address as many as time permits. We are recording this presentation and we'll post it on AFTD's website and YouTube channel. Please share it widely with others that you think might be interested. Speaking of our website, if you have FTD in your life, our website, theaftd.org, can be a source of help and support. For information on today's topic, be sure to visit the Genetics and FTD section of our website. You'll find it under Find Help on our homepage. And remember, AFTD's helpline is available by phone and email for anyone seeking information or resources related to FTD. At this point, I'd like to introduce our guest presenters. Jamie Fong is a certified genetic counselor and assistant professor in the Department of Molecular and Human Genetics, the clinic program at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston. Her professional interests include adult neurodegenerative disease and predictive genetic counseling. She speaks frequently about genetic counseling and dementia care, including at the 2019 AFTD Education Conference in Los Angeles. She's a member of the National Society of Genetic Counselors and a diplomat of the American Board of Genetic Counseling. Debbie Fenoglio is a retired nurse who served on AFTD's board of directors from 2011 to 2017. Her term included a stint as our vice chair. Her husband, Dr. Michael Fenoglio, was a prominent surgeon in Denver. He was diagnosed with FTD at age 51 and died at age 57. In addition, his sister also died of FTD at age 56. During her time on AFTD's board, Ms. Fenoglio worked with a focus on research and program development. So welcome to you both. We're very grateful to have you with us today, and I'm going to turn things over to Jamie, who will talk about genetic testing and FTD, after which Jamie will talk to Debbie about her personal experiences with FTD genetic testing.
Right.
Welcome, Jamie.
Thank you. Sorry. Okay. I hope everyone can see my slides. Thank you, Sharon, and for the kind introduction. Thank you also to the AFTD for the invitation to speak to you today. I'm delighted to participate in this webinar and share some information about practical aspects of what is likely a very important topic for people with FTD and their families. This talk is titled FTD and Genetic Testing, a Practical Approach. So the objectives I have for today's presentation portion are to review the genetics of FTD. We'll talk a little bit about who in the family to test first. We'll also review the genetic test process, going over some of the basics to consider. We'll also review other considerations. And the highlight of this webinar, Sharon spoke to this already, is that we will speak with Debbie Fenoglio, whose husband was diagnosed with FTD. I'll be interviewing her about her experience with genetic testing. So I think for many on this call, if not all, the day on which you learned the diagnosis is one that sticks in your memory. You may recall hearing it's frontotemporal degeneration, and at the time you may recall feeling bewildered or devastated or angry or even relieved. Maybe you felt a little bit of all of these things. At the time, or even in the moments following that diagnosis, there were probably a lot of questions that ran through your mind. What's next, for example? What about the kids? And also, what about brothers and sisters and their families? So certainly part of the journey that families face is what's next, how best to plan. And that's one piece of the thinking. The other piece is having to do with others in the family who could be at risk. And as you sat there in that moment, hearing first the diagnosis, or even as you sit here now and think about, how can genetic testing be of help? There are some things to keep in mind. And so if we think about frontotemporal degeneration and think, well, what proportion is genetic at all? We do know some about this. And I would say about 1 in 10 families, or about 10% of families with frontotemporal degeneration, actually face a genetic form. And by that, I mean there is a single gene change, also known as a variant, also known as a mutation, that is directly causing symptoms. Someone with the gene change or mutation will eventually go on to get symptoms. Those in the family who don't have the gene change will not develop genetic FTD in the future. And this is contrasted with sporadic FTD, where we think about half, or 1 in 2, 50% of all cases of frontotemporal degeneration are actually sporadic. So these cases are not due to a single gene change or mutation, and rather we don't fully understand why sporadic FTD happens in people. And then that leaves us with the last slice of the pie. About 2 in 5 families face what we might call a multifactorial form of FTD, or familial form, as sometimes it's referred to. So another way to think about this is the marble and jar illustration. And for those of you who attended the 2019 AFTD conference might have already heard me speak about this, but this is another way to think about kind of how we kind of group this genetic, multifactorial, and sporadic forms of FTD. So say we have this jar and we draw this line, which we'll describe as the threshold for FTD symptoms, wherein contents of the jar, if they rise above this line, we say that that's sufficient for someone to start displaying signs of FTD. And if the contents of this jar don't rise above that line, then we don't see symptoms of FTD. It's not sufficient to manifest symptoms. So in the genetic form of FTD, what we mean by this is that there is a gene that harbors or has in it a change or a mutation that has a large impact on a person's development of symptoms. So here that's illustrated by this large marble. And this is meant to represent the gene and the mutation in it that has a large impact, and it is enough to rise above that threshold line in the jar. And so we do see symptoms of FTD, and just from that gene mutation or gene change alone. So in any given family, there is this one gene. It has a large impact on whether or not someone develops symptoms. So we contrast this with multifactorial or familial form of FTD, where the jar looks different. And here we have more than one gene, as represented by the pink marbles. And of note, they are smaller than the blue marble in the picture to the left. And that is meant to represent a change or a variant within that gene that by itself is not enough to rise above the threshold line. And so we don't see symptoms of FTD with just that particular gene change alone. And instead, it's the combination of those marbles in this picture along with other marbles. So here, the green ones are meant to represent the environment or specific environmental factors, which we don't fully know what they are, but it's this combination of these genes with small or moderate impact along with environmental factors that rise above the threshold and lead to symptoms of FTD. And then still contrasted further is the sporadic form of FTD, where the jar looks a little like this. So here, the gene factors are represented by these orange marbles, and as you can see, they're even smaller than the pink ones and the blue ones, and they're no bigger and no smaller than the green environmental marbles if you will. And that's just meant to illustrate that the gene changes that contribute to sporadic FTD have a small impact. There's many of them involved, and they interact with the environmental factors, and it's all together the presence of all of those factors that lead someone to develop symptoms of FTD. So, what do we know about the genes that are responsible for this genetic or purely genetic form of FTD? There are three most common ones, and they are referred to by acronyms. The first one is known as the MAPT, or the tau gene. The second one is known as the progranulin gene, often noted as GRN. And the third one is the C9orf72 gene, also referred to as C9, or the FTD-ALS gene. So with regards to what are the genes involved in sporadic and multifactorial FTD, those are not entirely understood, as I mentioned earlier, and as a result, they are not readily tested for in the clinical setting. So what does a family with sporadic FTD look like? Here I've posted a kind of an illustration of a family tree, all represented by symbols. We've got squares for men, circles for women. A line between two symbols represents a couple. A line coming down from a horizontal line represents a child. A diagonal line through the symbol means that the person is deceased. And the symbols that are shaded represent someone with symptoms. So here we have this man with a diagnosis of frontotemporal degeneration, and we see that there's no one else in his family that has anything similar or related. And so this family tree is actually consistent with what we think about sporadic FTD, where if we were to go on to test this individual for the three big genes that we know to be FTD causing, we would find that in all likelihood, this person would not have a mutation in any of those three genes. And that's contrasted with this family tree, which is intended to represent kind of what a family with multifactorial FTD could look like. So here we have the man with FTD, and his cousin was diagnosed with an atypical Parkinsonism. So this was his mother's father's daughter. And so here, in contrast with sporadic FTD, there's not just one individual that we're thinking about, but there's two individuals. They're not necessarily very closely related, like parent-child or siblings, for example, but rather cousins. And so, the question arises, could their two diagnoses be related? Could it be due to a known FTD causing gene mutation? In all likelihood, if we were to test the individuals with symptoms in this family, we would likely see that neither of them has a change or mutation in any of the known FTD causing genes. And then that really captures multifactorial FTD. So in this case, what does a family with genetic FTD look like? Here, this illustration is meant to show this. We have the man with FTD. We know that his mother died of ALS, and that his mother has a brother who's living with ALS. There is a living sister who, if you can tell behind the illustration of the figure, is not shaded. And so, she has no symptoms. But there is yet another brother, the box shaded in brown, meant to represent another brother who had some sort of unspecified dementia. And that brother has a son with ALS who's living. And then there is yet another individual in the family, the grandmother to the person with FTD that we first talked about, who had some psychiatric history. She was reportedly completely dependent on others for her care. She passed away in a psychiatric hospital. So this is, if I step back and say what would happen if we tested this family for a mutation in one of these known genes, I would say it wouldn't surprise me, and in fact, I might expect that we would identify a change or mutation in the C9orf72 gene, just based on the number of people in the family with symptoms, how they're related to each other, and the fact that we see both FTD and ALS co-occurring in the family. So what's next, right? Whether you're a family that has a likely sporadic form or a family that has a likely genetic form, is a genetic test right for our family? You may be wondering, well, okay, if it's right for us, who should be tested first? How do we get the genetic test? Who pays for it? And what about direct-to-consumer genetic testing? I've heard of Ancestry.com, I've heard of 23andMe. Can those offerings help me? And then, does genetic testing affect my insurability? That's a big question that comes up. And of course, what if now is not the right time to test? So if we kind of unpack each of these questions, and we start with, is testing even right for our family? Going back to the family that I showed earlier, where there's many individuals with dementia as well as ALS. The individuals who have a diagnosis may be wondering, well, do I want to know whether or not this is a genetic form? Is it going to help me? Is it going to help others in my family? Alternatively, we've got a healthy aunt here who has no symptoms of either ALS or FTD. She might be wondering, have I passed the age at which I might have gotten the family condition? Am I in the clear? Is this something that I can clarify with genetic testing? And then, of course, what about future generations? We've got the man here with frontotemporal degeneration, and he has 3 adult children. Are they at risk? What about their children? So in all of these scenarios are valid in terms of kind of what are people thinking about with regressive genetic testing. And so if a person with FTD and or their caregiver, family members seek information about why this diagnosis happened, or if they are seeking available gene-based therapeutic trials, which more so today than 5-10 years ago are out there, or if they seek information about who else in the family could develop FTD, or even for families for whom it's not, it's not readily apparent that there's a lot of people who have similar or related symptoms. Maybe it's someone who has no family history of FTD in the family, but they still want to confirm that in fact it's not something that's genetic. So here you want to rule out a genetic cause. Then in any of these scenarios, it could be worth considering genetic testing. And of course, when you start to think about genetic testing, you're investigating information that has implications not only for you, but also for others in your family. So to that end, I think it's important that people talk to their families if that's at all possible, right? Especially for those who are motivated by the notion that they want to provide their family with information, right? Why not talk to the people for whom this matters, and kind of lay out the things you're considering. What if the test shows a genetic cause, right? Would you want to know my results? What if this test makes me eligible for an experimental medicine trial? Is that something that the family would want to consider or pursue, thereby making the test informative in that way? Who else should we tell? Should we tell the relatives? When do we tell the relatives? Maybe we tell them after we proceed with the testing, or maybe beforehand. Each family is going to be different. So kind of moving on to like, well, who should be tested in the family? I think there's the people in the family with symptoms, right? But they may be wondering, well, I already have my diagnosis. What more could genetic testing add to that? Why not just proceed with testing people in the family who are at risk, who don't yet already have a diagnosis? That question comes up a lot. And then speaking of healthy individuals in the family, right? What does their future hold? They may be wondering, let's proceed and get tested and clarify that. So in general, I will say that people with symptoms should actually be the people to test first. And this is in the case where the family mutation is not already known. If it's already known, then that's different. But if a family doesn't already know that they have a mutation in the family, it's always best to start with someone who has the diagnosis. You're more likely to find a genetic cause in someone who has the diagnosis rather than starting in someone who's entirely without symptoms and is healthy. And the reason is that limitations do arise if a healthy adult tests first, and in fact, results could be inconclusive. So I'm trying to illustrate that here, where we've got the branch of family just shown in duplicate. But let's say that in this branch of the family, this adult child decides, okay, well, I'm just going to go ahead and get tested. I'm the one who needs to determine what my future risk is. So I'm going to get tested, even though we don't already know the mutation in the family. And I speak about this adult child, but this could very well be her brother's. But say she gets tested and she learns that she has no FTD gene mutation, right? That scenario presents two possibilities of how that actually happened. One is that, okay, the reason that healthy adult child has no gene mutation is because her father, who has FTD, has an identifiable gene mutation, but that the daughter just didn't inherit it, right? That's the desired scenario that we're looking for, right? This would free this adult child of any future risk of genetic FTD, right? But actually, when in fact that result happens, that adult child has no gene mutation, we actually don't know, in fact, if perhaps her father, who has FTD, maybe he has an as yet undiscovered FTD causing gene mutation, right? I talked about those 3 most common genes implicated in genetic FTD. There are others which are more rare, and there are still possibly other families in whom we suspect a genetic FTD, but we haven't identified the culprit yet. So if that's the case, if that is actually a family where it's genetic FTD, but we don't know the cause yet, it hasn't been discovered, there is no test for it, in which case we would have missed something in that healthy adult child, right? So the 2 scenarios are that the one on the left represents no genetic risk for the healthy adult child. That's the desired scenario. But in fact, we can't know that for sure compared to this other scenario on the right, which is that, in fact, the genetic risk for the adult child, the healthy adult child, is not defined. It's unclear. She could still be at risk for the gene in her family that just hasn't been discovered yet. So of course we recognize that there are going to be instances where this person, the best person to test, the person with symptoms, is no longer with us, and I don't think that should deter families from getting tested. I think it's still important to keep in mind, how the interpretation of testing in that situation, what that means exactly. So how do we get the genetic test? How you go about it may be different depending on the setting in which the person with symptoms is able to participate in the process. And so if your loved one is still very able-bodied, is still seeing his neurologist or her neurologist or primary care provider, you're going to want to talk first to that provider, and I would recommend not only talking to that provider about what does this test mean for me, is it worthwhile, but if so, I would recommend a referral to a genetics professional, and together I think these providers should act in concert to help you obtain genetic testing, right? The piece about the genetics professional, like a genetic counselor, for example, is that this person is usually very familiar with genetic testing, the genetic testing process of the insurance piece of what lab to go with, what test exactly to order. If an individual is less able-bodied, but in the home, it's likely that that person is going to be having more regular interactions with their primary care provider. I'd recommend talking to that primary care provider, perhaps asking also for a referral to a genetics professional like a genetic counselor. And again, it'll be that working collaboratively to help your family get the test that you're interested in. For individuals who may be in a residential facility, it's a little more complicated. I would recommend reaching out first to a genetics professional, again, to discuss like what test, which lab, the logistics. But at some point, before any of the actual testing can happen, you are going to want to involve the medical professionals that more regularly provide care to your loved one. So in the assisted living facility, this might be the primary care provider. And in the skilled nursing setting, it might be the medical director of the facility. So who pays for the genetic test? There's a number of ways for this to be paid for. In the clinical setting, commercial insurance is often investigated first. Coverage of the test is going to depend on individual policies. And even if a commercial insurance covers the cost of testing, you may still be responsible for either in or out of network deductibles, co-insurance, and copay. What about Medicare? Unfortunately, Medicare does not guarantee coverage of the cost of testing. What often happens is that there is kind of point of service payment as the lab is conducting the test, and then any reimbursement that takes place can happen later, but that claim tends to be the family's responsibility. Alternatively, right, you may decide, look, I don't want to deal with insurance or Medicare, I'd rather just pay for it entirely myself. The extent of the cost will depend on which commercial lab is used and also which genetic test platform is used. So as I mentioned in previous slides, this is where the genetics professional, like a genetic counselor, can help in terms of, what is the best test to order, what is it actually looking at, what is it telling me, what is not, because there's a lot of options out there, and they're not all the same. And then, of course, there's the research. So you can obtain genetic testing in the research setting. I think it's important to keep in mind that every research study is going to be different. And so at the outset, you're going to want to confirm whether or not the study allows for return of results. That's not always the case. More and more studies are providing return of results, but you're going to want to double check. I think it's important to ask, if I get results that are paid for by the research, are they research grade results or are they clinical grade results? Clinical grade results are considered results that are valid for medical decision making. Research grade results are not. And then the timeline for return of results is going to vary. It can vary widely, study to study. So you're going to want to ask about that. And if the timeline is very important to you, you may end up kind of comparing and contrasting, which path makes the most sense for your family. So what about tests that do not require a physician's order? You may have seen these advertisements in print, on television, on the internet. They're out there. I will say that, so another word for them is called direct-to-consumer genetic testing. Sometimes it's referred to as at-home genetic testing. These are tests that can be ordered by anyone. You do not need a physician's order to do this. You can order them in a store, online. And in terms of cost, so these are always out of pocket. I don't believe insurance covers these direct-to-consumer genetic tests. They are much more affordable, relatively speaking, than physician-ordered tests. That is, if you're taking into account physician-ordered tests that are not covered by insurance. They yield results that are for direct release to the individual. So in contrast to physician order tests where the results go to the doctor and the doctor either calls you or brings you in for the appointment for results, direct to consumer genetic test results come straight to you, either usually by email or an online portal. Results from direct to consumer genetic testing, it's often provided in kind of a very readable report. Keep in mind that that's just a portion of the data that's actually generated by the testing. Some labs offer a separate raw data file, which is unprocessed genetic information. I think it's important to keep in mind that that raw data file is not all data. It's not a comprehensive look at all of your genes. So, the bottom line is that, direct to consumer gene tests do not provide information about underlying causes of FTD or future FTD risk. Does genetic testing affect my insurability? So the short answer is no. It affects insurability no differently than the actual clinical diagnosis. So again, keep in mind that this is for people with symptoms. People without symptoms have different considerations. So it's really the clinical diagnosis that drives a lot of decision making around what is covered and what is not by insurance. Insurance underwriting considers a person's diagnosis regardless of the underlying gene cause. So whether the FTD has a genetic cause or not, the question is, what is the diagnosis? What are the symptoms? People with FTD are protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act. If there's a concern about, well, what about the family history, right? What about mom with ALS, uncle with FTD? In fact, family history is protected by law. There's a federal law known as GINA, or the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. And all this legislation is in place, and it's intended to encourage people to share freely their family histories with their doctors. And also, this legislation is in place to again, not to deter anyone who seeks genetic testing. So what if now is not the right time to test? I think certainly, in the face of FTD, there can be a lot of, things to consider, and one's priorities could not be on genetic testing, and that would, be entirely understandable. And so, what about the individual in the family who is the best person to test first, but it's maybe not the right time because, that person may be near the end of life, or maybe that person is just ambivalent, that, they're not certain if they really want to proceed with genetic testing. And also sometimes, this can happen, but family members can disagree about whether or not genetic testing should even be done on the person in whom it makes most sense to start. And for others, coordination of testing through a care facility can be quite burdensome, because that not only, we talked about how it involves the medical director of the skilled nursing facility and the primary care provider and the genetic professional. It still requires a lot of work on the family's end to kind of make that all happen. Also, maybe this is someone in your family who's had prior genetic testing, and no FTD gene mutation has been identified, even though maybe there's like a family history that's suggestive of that. In these instances, DNA banking could be an option for you. What is DNA banking? It's a lot like personal finance banking. It is the secure storage of a person's genetic material for future testing. Instead of the financial banks, we have these laboratories, often the same laboratories that conduct genetic testing, but they have kind of standalone banks where they will store blood or saliva. And again, this is not something that is usually paid for by insurance, but rather this would be a self-pay choice. And whether it's blood or saliva, DNA is extracted from the sample and then stored for a set period of time. And once it's banked, the DNA can be withdrawn for testing by the account holder or whoever the family has authorized as having access. So in sum, we've covered a lot. I think the key take-home points are that it's important to hold a family meeting to discuss this decision to test, right? Especially in consideration of identifying risk for others, which is a big reason why someone often pursues genetic testing. Once you've identified the best person with whom to start testing, you're going to want to think about how best to approach that relative or their caregiver, and see if they might be willing to provide this kind of information for the whole family. I'd recommend speaking to a genetic provider like a genetic counselor. Certainly, if you're not sure who in the family should be tested first, you could always reach out to a genetics professional, before approaching the relative, or even thinking together with the genetic counselor, for example, about strategies on how to approach the relative. This is a big one. I mean, you're going to want to sit and consider the test value versus test cost, right? What is this information going to give me? How can I use it? What is the value of this test? And if needed, families might have to make a plan for test payment, whether partial or total payment, or you could consider research. Recognize that direct-to-consumer genetic testing, while easy to obtain, cannot identify FTD cause or clarify future risk. So there may be other reasons why you might be interested in direct-to-consumer testing, but just know that it's not going to provide answers about this particular question about who has genetic FTD and who's at risk. Recognize that genetic testing doesn't increase the chance of an FTD person's loss of insurability. And of course, if now is not the right time to test, you might consider DNA banking for a later time. I think at any point in this sequence of events, you're going to reach out to others, right? Places like the AFTD for additional education and support. And also, there are surely other people who have either considered genetic testing or have gone through the process of genetic testing. Talk to them about their experience. And that actually kind of brings us to our interview with Debbie Fenoglio. And before we proceed with that, I just wanted to share some thanks. Thanks both to the All FTD Consortium and to my colleagues at Baylor College of Medicine. So thank you. Okay, great. So now we're going to take this time to speak with Debbie Fenoglio, retired nurse, whose physician husband, Dr. Michael Fenoglio, was diagnosed with FTD at 51 and died at 57. Debbie has kindly offered to be interviewed about her family's experience with genetic testing. And first off, I just want to say thank you very much, Debbie, for joining us and for your willingness to share your and your husband's story.
Thank you, Jamie. It's good to be here.
Yeah. So maybe to help kind of orient our audience, can you take us back to the year when your husband Mike was diagnosed? Can you tell us about what was going on in your life?
Sure. At that time, Mike was at the height of his medical career. He was a well-respected general surgeon in our community, as well as nationally and internationally. However, probably about a year to a year and a half prior to his diagnosis, we began noticing changes in his behavior and his personality. He was becoming much more egocentric and apathetic, inappropriate in social situations from time to time, where he would tell inappropriate jokes, perhaps, or just make inappropriate comments. These were all things that were so unlike the Mike that we knew and loved. We did pursue different avenues. We treated him for anxiety disorder. We also explored bipolar disease. His mother was diagnosed with bipolar disease early on in her adult life. Of course, the outcome from any of those treatments was did not change any of the behaviors that we were seeing in Mike. And so eventually a neuropsych test was ordered, and that was when eventually the diagnosis of frontotemporal degeneration came. I was a stay-at-home mom at that time. We had 4 children. Mike was married before, and his 2 older children were living in Texas. His oldest son was 28 and does have Down syndrome. His daughter was 25. She was married and celebrating the birth of her first daughter, and the 2 youngest were at home with us. Our son was a senior in high school and was 18, and our daughter was a freshman in high school and was 15.
A time of many landmarks, it sounds like.
Definitely,
yeah.
definitely.
And so at the time that Mike's diagnosis came, what questions kind of ran through your mind as you tried to kind of piece it all together?
That's a loaded question, Jamie. A lot of questions came to mind. I remember clearly the day that the neuropsychologist called to schedule an appointment to discuss the results of the testing that he had done with Mike. And as you kind of alluded to, my initial response was one of great relief. I thought, finally, we have found answers. We're going to be able to fix this, and we're going to be able to move forward with our lives, and things will get back to normal. Little did I know that sense of relief was going to be very short-lived when we found out the diagnosis of FTD, and it became a complete devastation for us. When we realized that there was, at that point in time, no cure, there was no treatment, and it was indeed a fatal disease, the questions that came to mind, interestingly enough, about a month or a month and a half before Mike was diagnosed, he had random bilateral DVTs, or blood clots in his legs. So he was already on medical leave. Obviously, that was extended dramatically, and he was never able to go back to work after diagnosis. But the questions for us as a family were, again, I was a stay-at-home mom. Would I have to go back into the workforce? And if that was the case, how are we going to support Mike moving forward? Were the kids going to be able to stay in the high school that they were in? Was our son going to be able to move on to the college that was out of state that he had been accepted at? How were we going to even tell our kids about a diagnosis of a father that they adored and idolized, and that the behaviors that we were seeing in him was not going to change, and was only going to progress and get worse? Those were all kinds of questions that were going through our mind. We're talking about 2007. There wasn't a whole lot of knowledge. The AFTD was certainly on the breakthrough, and it became our lifeline. Researched their website through and through many times, though it felt like the information was coming in one ear and going right out the other ear, because it was overwhelming and devastating.
Yeah, I think it's hard to hear and listen and integrate when there's so much going on, and you're juggling so much at once. And I, from what you're sharing, I can hear that the family was a huge focus for you and for Mike, and so, you know, with your family in mind, you know, at what point did you start considering genetic testing, or considering this question of could this be genetic?
Well, our situation was a little bit different than a lot. Well, not necessarily a lot of people, but Mike was a sibling of four, or was one of four siblings, and he had two older sisters and a younger brother. And his oldest sister that was closest in age to him, who was 2 years older than he, was diagnosed 2 years prior as well, with what we as a family were kind of told it was similar to early onset Alzheimer's. Even though we did, she was in Texas, she lived in Texas at the time, we would go and visit, we would obviously see the changes in her personality and her behaviors as well. Fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know, we never did align the two. When I was sitting at the neuropsychologist's office and he gave us the diagnosis of FTD, it was just like a light bulb went off. And my sister-in-law was there as well, and we just looked at each other and we just said, wow, it's the same disease. And it was indeed one of the same. And when we decided to pursue genetic testing, it wasn't necessarily pursuing genetic testing as probably confirming that there was a genetic component. We then went on to the National Institute of Health. They were actually doing an FTD research study at the time. I felt that that was going to be the place to go, and that they would be on the breaking edge of any kind of research to be found for the treatment of FTD. We went out there basically for a second opinion because Mike was convinced he was going back to work, and he just needed to find someone that would give him the okay. We were there for about a week, and there was extensive testing done with MRIs and CT scans and PET scans and interviews for both Mike and myself, and blood work was done at the time as well. We did have an exit interview, and that was when the diagnosis was confirmed, as well as confirmation of a genetic mutation.
Yeah, so you in your search for for resources and answers, it sounds like you stumbled on a team that had experience with this and kind of knew how to help you navigate. And so I guess I'm wondering, even before those conversations that you had with the NIH, did you and following the conversation with the neuropsychologist, did you talk to others in the family about, hey, this looks like it's genetic, should we confirm it? Was this something you talked about with others?
We did talk amongst Mike's siblings about it possibly being a genetic component, yes. We didn't go to a lot of detail about it. It wasn't something that I felt like I needed to ask permission for. Sure. Mike's family was always and continues to be extremely supportive of any of the treatment avenues that we chose for Mike. And Mike, as I mentioned earlier, was a physician, and there was no question that this was the avenue that he would want to go with the research and the genetic testing. And he would certainly do everything he could to help the future for our children and for the generations to come, that if there was any information that he could provide.
Yeah, it sounds like as a family, you have always been kind of, just given your background, his background, kind of medically minded, and you saw right away the value of the information from genetic testing. So, yeah, no, I see that, and you've mentioned that the family has always been very supportive. Did that hold true as you told them, hey, look, we're going to the NIH to investigate this?
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was, they were very supportive. And actually, his younger brother came out and spent a few days out there with us as well. He did choose to have his blood work drawn at that time as well. Their oldest sister, chose not to have any blood work drawn and chose not to participate in the study. We did contact the husband of the sister that was affected, and they chose as well not to participate. They did not and do not have children, so their focus was a lot different than ours. And
Sure.
Libby was fairly advanced at that point in time into the disease, and travel was not an option for her. And again, we had asked for perhaps a possibility of sending in some blood work, and that was still not something that they wanted to pursue.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I think just hearing your family's experience and hearing how the different branches of the family kind of handled it differently, right? I think it is probably reflective of many other families in the audience or across the country, where it's a very deeply personal decision about how to approach testing and do you pursue it.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so did you before you traveling to the NIH, did you wonder about what you might expect from genetic testing?
You know, I wish I had had your presentation before I went to NIH. I'll tell you that, Jamie. Things were moving really fast at that point in time for us. Again, we just had gotten the diagnosis in November of 2007, and we were at NIH in 2008. And just a few months had passed by. I don't know that I really knew what answers to ask or what to expect in a research setting. But as you had pointed out in your presentation, it's very important to know what they are willing to share with families in a research setting, because it's not necessarily what you would expect.
Sure. Okay. And tell us about the day you learned Mike's genetic results. How did you receive it? What were you feeling and thinking at the time? And what was Mike's response? Sorry.
No, that's okay. It was an exit interview at the NIH is when we learned of it, and that the diagnosis was indeed confirmed. Mike's younger brother was with us as well. We were there with the researchers that was there for Mike's study, and they confirmed the diagnosis. Then they also confirmed a genetic mutation was indeed the cause of Mike's FTD. It didn't come as a complete shock, again, because of his older sister's diagnosis as well. So it wasn't total devastation, but you do still hang on to, as unrealistic as it probably was, you still hang on to that little bit of hope that there was another explanation. And even though it would not have necessarily changed Mike's outcome, you would certainly hanging on to some hope that maybe your children would not be affected in the future with it.
Yeah. No, I think hope is so important in this setting, as we think about what could be in the future, what's to come. And so it sounds like for your family there weren't it wasn't as huge a surprise as maybe it could have been, had his sister not also had a diagnosis. But
Exactly.
And so tell us about those conversations that you had with Mike's family after confirming without a doubt that this was genetic, that there was something running in the family.
We kind of did a little bit more family research then, of course, and we had, as I had mentioned earlier, Mike's mother was diagnosed with bipolar disease early on in her adult life. from what I can gather and from what each one of the siblings had said, she did respond well to medication and treatment. She died at age 57 of lung cancer. That was 22 years before Mike's sister was diagnosed. So would she have developed FTD symptoms later on? I don't know. Was she misdiagnosed all along? Was something that we don't know either. We do know that the maternal grandmother of Mike's maternal grandmother was institutionalized at a very young age for erratic behavior. We did come across her death certificate, which stated choking was the reason of death. She was 36 years old, and the date was 1925. There was a maternal uncle that committed suicide, but outside of that, which kind of looking back on things is pretty significant, there was no really other family history. We don't know of any other cousins or any other ones that are affected.
Yeah, I think, certainly in, just thinking back on the slides I presented, sure, there are families for whom it's so apparent that there's something beyond just chance alone that is leading to, two individuals with two diagnoses. But I think, what I'm hearing about Mike's family is that they're maybe in retrospect, you recognize that there were individuals in the family who likely maybe shared the family mutation, but it wasn't really known until after the diagnosis was made. So I'm wondering, in many respects, the genetic testing kind of clarified or kind of crystallized maybe who in the family might have had it. Is that fair to say?
That's correct. I do think that it kind of solidifies some of the questions that we had, for instance, about the maternal grandmother and that type of thing. But again, there was not a whole lot that we found outside of our immediate family, outside of Mike and his sister. We didn't, and again, because Mike's mom had passed away 22 years prior to that, one will assume that she was misdiagnosed and it was FTD all along. But from what the two, either the older sister and the younger brother, the symptoms were not similar whatsoever.
Yeah. And so, once you had that confirmation in hand that this was genetic, what conversations did you have with people? Take us back to those times, whether it was with Mike's siblings or your own children, friends. What did you share with them?
We kept it pretty closed for quite a while, I think, and mainly because at the time, Andrew, Mike's oldest son, again, has Down syndrome, so to really discuss that with him was not something that we were really able to do. His daughter had already started her family, and and our two younger ones were young, and the idea of wrapping yourself around your loved one's diagnoses of FTD, much less thinking that there might be a genetic component, is devastating and daunting all at the same time. And, even though I knew that there was a genetic mutation and we as a family did, we did not have any in-depth conversations with our children until probably 5 years later. They were aware that there was a genetic mutation, but we didn't really talk into great detail about what that might mean. They were living the disease. They knew what it was like. And, the roles were being reversed in our own home, and they were helping to take care of and becoming a caregiver for their father as well. And so the idea of actually pursuing at the initial time a possible genetic mutation was not something that we as a family were able to even comprehend. And
Sure.
I think that's why 4 and 5 years later, we were much stronger. We had a lot more knowledge. The kids were much more mature. That was when we started to really delve into the results of the genetic test. And I did reach out to NIH once again, and luckily I was able to find some of the researchers that we had been involved with, and was actually able to get the actual mutation. And not surprising, because it was a behavioral variant, that it was the MAPT tau mutation. And we talked in detail about each child having a 50% chance of carrying the mutation. We talked about research studies as they started to become available, and the three youngest, or the three children, decided we did not involve Andrew in research study, but decided that they would like to participate. So we did enroll in the Lefties program out at Columbia University, and each time that the kids went out there for their study, they were able to meet with a genetic counselor and have conversations with her regarding the actual mutation and what that might look in their future. And they all decided that they did not want to know the results of the genetic testing at that point in time.
Yeah. And I think it kind of just speaks to the fact that it is such a personal decision. It depends on, right, where a person is in their life and how they came to know the FTD in their family. And I'm struck by kind of your timeline with this information, and how in many ways kind of your experience gave you that time to sit with it yourself and to process it before you were able to kind of digest it and share it with your kids. And so certainly I think that's something that every family who's considering testing or not testing is going to want to think about. And so given all of this, right, and then it seems like it was a long road, perhaps, and it may be something that you're still thinking about with your family. What was the one thing that surprised you, good or bad, about your experience with genetic testing, with the counseling?
And again, as you alluded to in your presentation, I think that, one thing that one really, if you choose the research route, you do need to be aware of what their protocol is and how much information they're going to share, because one can't necessarily assume that you're going to get all of the information that you anticipated getting. I think that's very important, and that was kind of surprising to me. The whole research arena was something that was kind of new and surprising to me. I would suggest that, and again, like you had alluded to, that it is an individual choice, and you need to respect and honor that. And if you're talking about adult children of someone who has been diagnosed with FTD, they get to choose how they want to follow through with that, and when they want to follow through with that. And because our children decided that they did not want to know at this stage of their lives, does not mean that they cannot go back and get the results later on.
Right.
So that, I think, knowledge is empowering when you're dealing with the disease of FTD. It was something that we knew nothing about until Mike was diagnosed, and now we have knowledge and we have resources. And again, I can't speak highly enough about AFTD, because the work that they are doing and the research that is going on is so promising and so hopeful that we can make much more informed decisions than we could many years back. So,
Sure. Yeah, no, I think, whenever you're faced with a tough situation, tough decisions, it's always nice to have, have folks in your corner who get it, who understand. And certainly it sounds like, not only did you have your family, but you also had, the AFTD, which is great. And so, if you had to go back and start this process all over again, is there anything that you would have done differently, or maybe not, and why or why not?
I don't know that there would have been something that I would have done differently. I think I would have taken a little bit more time to research my options. I kind of think that I felt somewhat pressured because, again, Mike was convinced that he was just going to be able to go back to work. So pursuing a second opinion and a third opinion was something that we needed to do in order for him to, in his ability at that time, be able to understand that that was not something that he was going to be able to do. I would encourage anybody who, again, is looking perhaps in the research arena to look at the logistics of that and realize that as your loved one progresses into the disease, that travel is extremely difficult. And if at all possible, the closer you can be to a research study, perhaps the better you can be. So, because I do believe and I understand that it is so important, and the longer you can participate, the more information and valuable information will be able to be gathered.
Sure. Yeah. And I think that's what's changing some of those considerations is the growing availability of these gene-based therapeutic trials,
Exactly.
where I think, people are recognizing that families aren't going to be right next door to a research center. So, yeah, and so and so I guess that brings me to my last question, and that is there anything that you wanted to share with the audience that I haven't already asked about, or that you haven't already shared?
I don't think so. I think we've covered it pretty well. Again, just to emphasize the fact that it is an individual choice, and you need to know when you choose whether it is the one that is exhibiting symptoms. When you are going to have that genetic testing done, who is that going to affect? Is it your adult children? Is it siblings? And again, our situation, we couldn't have asked for a more supportive family, and that's not always the case. We were very fortunate in that way. I think that know your adult children and or your children and how they might react to that. I remember when we were talking about it initially, our son's reaction was, "Well, there's a 50% chance I don't," and our daughter's reaction was, "I've got it." I mean, it was plain and simple. 50-50 just meant to her it was that she had the mutation. And as the years have gone by and they have gathered more knowledge on their own and that type of thing, it's not the first thing that they think about when they wake up in the morning.
Sure.
It's not far behind, but it's not the first thing. Mike had, and I think it's a good thing to remember that Mike had done so much good, and he accomplished so much and changed so many people's lives in his short time here. And I think we as a family have embraced that, and that is our goal moving forward, is that we too can make a difference, and we will live each day, because it's not a given. And we're just going to live each day to the fullest and be as productive as we possibly can.
Yeah, sir. Truly words of wisdom, born of deep experience with this. So thank you, Debbie, very much for your candor. I have no doubt that your experience, has resonated with our audience today, and I just want to thank you again, and thank you to the audience. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Sharon.
So thank you both so much for what is such an important conversation. And I too appreciate your candor and Jamie, your guidance. I think that the information that you shared and the conversation that you've facilitated really underscore, one, the value of information. The information can be powerful for folks. Of course, our whole intent is to be able to bring that information to a wider audience all the time to help people know the options and the resources that are available to them. So I thank you very much for that. We do have quite a few questions, and so I want to move right to those questions so that folks who've been with us can hear your responses. And I want to start with a couple of really specific ones because people are understanding the importance of your words, and I think want to know how to line up their next steps and their next actions. So you've made it really clear and helped to give us understanding of why genetic counseling can be so helpful. Can you just go back and speak to how do people go about finding a genetic counselor if that's what their next step is?
Sure. Yes. No, thank you, Sharon. That's a great question. I'm happy to speak to that. And certainly, your neurologist and/or primary care provider may know exactly how to refer to a genetic counselor. If not, or if it's something that you wanted to initiate on your own in advance or in parallel with conversations with your neurologist and/or primary care provider, you could also go to the website www.nsgc.org, and that is the website for the National Society of Genetic Counselors. And there is a Find a Counselor feature in that website. You can search by your zip code or by specialty. So that's one starting point. Alternatively, research networks like AFTD have genetic counselors kind of embedded in their projects, and so that's another way to reach out to your nearest AFTD center to find a genetic counselor.
And I can also put in a pitch. The page that we pointed people to on the AFTD website has the link for the National Genetic Counselors that you're referencing, Jamie, so people can find that reference there as well. There was a similar question about finding a lab that does genetic testing. So can you speak to what does that mean if people want to know how do you find a lab that does genetic testing?
Yeah, so there's not one database or clearinghouse for how to find a genetic testing lab. I think that's in part why I think it's helpful to talk to a genetics professional like a genetic counselor beforehand, who can help direct you to the most appropriate lab. Most of the labs that do offer FTD genetic testing, they don't typically accommodate just patient and family orders. These are tests that have to be ordered by the provider. But I mean, the largest commercial labs, serve all of the U.S. And I would strongly encourage talking to your genetics provider first before looking for a lab.
So the provider needs to provide that prescription in order to order the test or an
Yes.
order of the test. And that's going to, in part, direct people to what resources and labs are available and appropriate.
Yes.
There's another question about the role of consent if the person who is symptomatic is further progressed. Can you speak to that? What role does the individual's ability to provide consent themselves play in genetic testing?
Yeah, I can speak to that, and maybe Debbie as well. I mean, I think it can be a complex decision, right, in terms of who's having the test, but who is that information for? And I would encourage families to reach a consensus and in so much as they're able, in so much as their person with FTD is able to participate, you know, to all get on the same page, and that can be a challenge, because I think that could be an evolving question about, you know, how much does the person with FTD understand, how much are they, you know, expressing in the way of, you know, what they think this genetic testing is for. And I think it can be a difficult scenario, because you will find different people in the family kind of valuing the genetic test differently. So certainly I think, you know, as I think we would all advocate here on this panel, you know, we want to treat our persons with FTD with respect, and to include them in as much as they're able, and as much as they want to. You know, at the same time, I think maybe it's important to kind of help frame the proposal of genetic testing in a way that speaks to the person with FTD's perspectives or thoughts, right? In terms of if, you know, this could help the family.
Thanks. Yeah, that's helpful. And I'm going to ask both of you to answer this question, I think. So the question is that given that research is not yet to the point of understanding the cause of FTD completely, what do you see as the main advantage to someone knowing if they have the gene?
Well, again, I'll just speak to it briefly. And again, I think that as much knowledge that you can gather up when you're faced with this diagnosis, the better off you're going to be. And you know, it's an ongoing process, and you're going to be gathering information for a long, long time to come. We're still gathering information, and it changes quickly. And I think that the more informed you are, and the more poignant your decision-making process can be in the future.
Yeah, and I would echo what Debbie says. I think, you know, there is value in this information. Certainly, you know, I think there's a lot of hope about the future prospects of therapeutic trials, that there are some already on the horizon. And, you know, when those trials become available, right, it may take you time then to, you know, determine if you're eligible, if it is a gene-based trial. And so in some ways, you know, having some information before the rollout of any therapeutic trial might be helpful, because then you can kind of nimbly kind of navigate those research waters if that's something that's important to the family. And also, I think, you know, so much of how we understand any therapeutic medicine to work really relies on kind of what we're able to learn from families who are actually facing FTD. And so, you know, we turn to families to inform us about, you know, what they're experiencing, what any impact of any medicine might be, or the impact of day-to-day symptoms, right? I think that's how researchers can best kind of develop the therapies, whether it's you know, medicines, or if it's behavioral interventions.
Thank you. There's a question about being able to, some folks are familiar with brain donation as a way of confirming a diagnosis and getting the pathology report back. Can you speak to the role of genetic testing at the time of autopsy? Is that a viable option? Is that complicated?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, so yes, so genetic testing upon autopsy can be done, and there are so first off, I think, you know, brain autopsy is often done in the research setting. There are avenues for brain autopsy outside of the research setting, but if genetic testing can happen, after one has passed, the opportunities for genetic testing are just a little more easy in the research side of things than having a family pay for a private autopsy through the hospital setting. I think you want to ask specifically about the autopsy program and that program's ability to conduct genetic testing of the brain tissue. So it's not routine for genetic testing to be done of autopsy samples. It can happen in large research settings, but it is not part of the actual autopsy process. And so you'll just want to double check with the research program that if and whether that testing is happening.
So options for either DNA banking or other options to pursue that testing during life should be equally considered. I think there is a confusion for many people that genetic testing is not an automatic part of a brain autopsy. And that distinction, I think, is valuable. So I appreciate the person who had asked the question about that, to make sure that people recognize exploring all the options and being informed about all the options is important for what's going to work best for within any individual situation or family. A couple other questions. We have a few minutes left. You had mentioned, Jamie, the 3 main genes that are identified as causes in familial FTD. There's a person asking about some of those lesser known or really, really rare genes. And so can they be tested for as well? And they're specifically naming, of course, VCP, the CHIMP-B2, and TAR-DBD, hard to say. What's testing look like for those, and how frequently is it done?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and thank you for the person who asked that. So yes, all those genes that you named, VCP, TAR, DBP, FUS, UBQLN1, those are all testable, and these are these are considered genes that can harbor changes or mutations that lead directly to symptoms. So these are what we might consider the causal FTD genes. And yes, testing is available in both the clinical setting and the research setting for these genes. These gene tests are often done as panels where they can look at multiple genes at the same time from one sample. And so, again, both in the research and the clinical setting, it can be done. It just depends on which lab is selected on the clinical side. And then in the research side, you're more likely to find comprehensive testing because it kind of serves the research endeavor.
Great, thank you. Do different clinical presentations, for example, PPA versus behavioral variant FTD, have different rates of genetic versus sporadic cases? Are genetic cases equally distributed across the clinical presentations?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And generally speaking, we know that the proportion of behavioral variant FTD cases that are due to a single gene cause are greater than we might see in either of the PPAs. That's not to say that there aren't instances of genetic non-fluent variant PPA or genetic semantic variant PPA, but often, not always, often the context of the family history can help, where in families that have a genetic form of PPA, we're more likely to see other relatives with either similar or related symptoms.
So bear with me 1 second, sorry. Someone's asking about the gene editing tools and CRISPR, which we hear about in the popular press in terms of research advances. And do these play a role potentially in helping to change mutations that are involved in inherited FTD?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's a lot of excitement about genetic technology, and I think certainly I think there's room on the horizon for that. I think presently clinical genetic testing does not involve that. I mean, right now it's technology that is just looking to see if we can identify the genetic culprit in the first place. And I anticipate version 2.0 or 3.0, we'll see more applications of technology like CRISPR or other gene editing technologies.
Great, thanks. The technology and advances are expanding the field in many ways. So one additional question, you had talked about DNA banking and being able to test blood samples in the future. Someone's asking about if the samples of children's blood from the spinal cord from early on is stored. Can that be tested for these genes, or is it better to get an updated current blood test to be tested?
Yeah, that's a good, and with specific regard to DNA banking,
not necessarily as another avenue for accessing the sample to be tested.
I see. Yeah. So, so the type of sample that is testable, at least by these commercial laboratories, they are the ones that kind of determine that. And most commonly, the tests that are available are of saliva or of blood. It is not usually the case that a commercial lab that offers FTD genetic testing can test other samples. And so to that end, yes, it would involve a separate sample that is given specifically for genetic testing. That is typically how it's done.
Great, thanks. Is it possible to get genetic testing with it remaining confidential and not becoming part of your medical record?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I think, you might want to consider kind of the scenario in which you're seeking this kind of test. So if we're talking about someone who has symptoms already, and you're concerned about getting genetic testing for that person with symptoms, that's one thing I would ask. Is there a particular reason why confidential testing of someone with symptoms is important to you, right? In terms of, there's already a diagnosis, and the genetic testing is just to determine is it inherited or not. If it's a question of someone who doesn't yet have symptoms, who is interested in confidential testing, well, that's a fair consideration. And to that, it would depend on the clinic. So in the clinical setting, each clinic operates differently in how they offer testing, whether someone can use an alias or someone can be anonymous and test. That's going to be, there will be differences clinic to clinic. If it's in the research setting, I mean, typically research results are of any kind, genetic results included, are kept separately from the clinical record. So it depends on the setting, and it depends on who we're testing, someone with symptoms or no symptoms.
Well, and thank you. And there's a number of other questions related to insurance, and a number of other questions related to GINA and protections around confidentiality. And I think what your responses indicate is that there's so many specific considerations that being able to work one-on-one with a provider, with a genetics professional, with your neurologist, to have, as you had said so eloquently before, have a partner to walk through this with you. And certainly, Debbie, your experience and that of what you're describing for the rest of your family indicates the value of having partners to walk through this with you over time. There's no one point in time where the conversation ends. And I think for as much as the research is changing and families change and people individually grow and change, that flexibility and the relationships that can be made to help carry people along, both for informal supports and formal supports, are just really critically important. And so with that, I'm going to thank you. And I know that you devoted a lot of time to help us with the presentations and the wonderful interview and the questions. And so thanks very much. We're going to move on to our final slide and close up. But I know that everybody with us today really shares a great appreciation for spending your time with us. So thank you very much. And that is all the time that we have today. And we're very grateful to both Jamie and Debbie for being with us. I hope you found the presentation to be really informative. We will post the recorded version on the website under our News and Events tab, and we'll send out the link as soon as it's available. As a reminder, this is the first in a series of 3 genetics-focused webinars that we'll present in the coming month. Future genetics webinars will focus on considerations around predictive testing for people with a familial history of FTD, as well as a webinar on emerging research in the known FTD mutations. Please be sure to follow us on social media and check back on our website for more information about these events as they become available. So again, thank you for joining us today. Please always let us know if you have any comments or questions about our presentation or other ways that AFTD can assist you moving forward. Please be sure to visit the website and make use of the helpline as you need to. And until next time, we wish you very well and thanks for joining us.